next session is very interesting. As we saw the video, a subject of which part of that video is creating your own content outside your broadcast rights and having that exclusive content, that content menu to reward and acknowledge the fan and take the fan behind the scenes in places that they haven't been to before. The coaching lessons, for example, what's happening with the players and their recovery. So to discuss that more, I'd like you to please welcome Scott Dinsdale, the Media and Entertainment Lead for Australia and Asia Pacific for Accenture, and he's with Finn Bradshaw, Head of Digital for Cricket Australia. Thanks, Scott.
It was going to be good morning, everybody, but good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. We sit between here and lunch, so we're going to try and get through some questions. Just think about what an exciting time this is, right? You got a region that's half the world's population, a third of the world's GDP, and we're looking at a sports market that's not a glass half full, but maybe a couple of drops in the glass. And so enormous growth potential. When we talk about digital, which we're going to get into in a minute, arguably the most digital region in the world, maybe a chance, frankly, to maybe leapfrog a little bit of what's holding back some of the other parts of the world. So I look at this with sort of internal optimism. One of the things we do at Accenture is we love to work with leaders in the marketplace, people like BT Sport and the NFL that we've talked about today. And Finn, as I've told you directly many times, we very actively sought out a partnership with Cricket Australia. We started streaming live about a year ago now, just under a year ago. Had a terrific last season. Didn't know it was going to be quite as terrific on the cricket side. It was a great season. Now doing a lot more things. We really do look at Cricket Australia as one of the global leaders in development of digital rights. So maybe if you would, sort of by way of introduction, just take a few minutes, talk about the deals, how it's structured, and how you view that development, because it really is something that I think everyone needs to look at as a real leadership model in the market.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and thanks, everyone. We've got quite a unique deal on our digital rights front. Cricket Australia has done a partnership with Nine Entertainment Corp. They've long been a broadcast rights holder for Cricket Australia. Previously on the digital side, it tended to sort of fall to either the telco, that was our major partner, so Vodafone did our native apps previously, or we sort of outsourced it, like Nine did a bit of digital stuff early days. And it didn't really work for cricket as a whole. In that space, we fell behind other sports. So last year when the rights were up, Cricket Australia decided to, they could just continue to take that check that people write, and broadcasters all over the world want to write those big checks as a defensive play as much as anything in the digital space. But instead, we've done a partnership which is joint funded by Cricket Australia and Nine Entertainment. But Cricket Australia retains all the control of the production roadmap and, more importantly, controls all of the content delivery. Now, that's the interesting path that Cricket Australia boldly went down. Is they didn't decide to do that so that they could whitewash the message and just put out PR puff pieces. They wanted this to be a dominant platform, and they knew that for it to be something that we could actually win in the marketplace or gain a sizable audience, you need to have that trust with the audience. And so we couldn't selectively report. We had to report everything that happened. And so I think that's part of the reason probably that I was brought on board. I was previously working for News Corp Australia. I was in charge of all the digital sport content across all their digital platforms, from foxsports.com.au through news.com.au and the newspapers. And so I brought that sort of history of working for a fairly aggressive media company, but also that I could establish a strong editorial team that would have credibility with the audience. Now that's caused some uncomfortable moments for me just about on a daily basis, both with internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. Other media hate it. They hate us getting in on their turf. But I think you want to sort of separate the success of the team last year with the success of the website, but I think it's showing that it's going the right way. The audience really is enjoying what we're doing, and hopefully the team keeps winning. It makes our jobs a lot easier.
Yeah, you talked about a bit of the internal tension. Do you feel any compromise with a code? So if you sort of put your purist journalist hat on for just a minute, can a code report on itself?
Yeah, I think it's something that we learn every day. You think you've covered every scenario and a new one's thrown up, and it's challenging. You have to have really strong internal processes around it. And so it's got to the point where I've said to the comms team, just deal with us like we're Australia's #1 cricket website. So, of course you give exclusives to people in the media, and you probably give more exclusives to the #1 cricket website, but we don't want to get a heads up on things. That only compromises us. And so a lot of the fights that I've done internally is to free up my journalists so that they've got freedom to report on things. I don't want them having to put on a comms hat and think about how does this reflect on, what are the wider implications of this? Just, is this a good story that fans are interested in? That's got to be the #1 thing they think about. And so I would rather we don't get a drop on the team announcements, we don't get a drop on the new captain of the one-day side or whatever, if that frees us up to report on it. And I think we've been fortunate in Australia that the Australian Football League has been really strong in that area. I read an article today where they had a column on their website really criticising their judicial process. And they're big and bad enough to be able to handle that kind of honest and frank discussion. I think you can. And I also think, that if you don't, it'll show up in your traffic really quickly. Fans will smell you a rat.
They get it pretty quickly. Interestingly, the NFL was one of the places that really sort of pioneered this. They're going through a real trial by fire over the last few weeks.
Thankfully, we haven't had, they had in 1 week, they had domestic violence, child abuse. We haven't had it, we've had Michael Clark swearing.
In a place where, the head of their code now is under such fire, they're still, at least at this point, sitting, I'm a big NFL fan, I get my newsletter every day, and they still are exhibiting that sort of journalistic sort of objectivity, and we'll see how that lasts. So you mentioned fan engagement. There's a lot of conversations we had today about, too many people, are there too many players? I would argue maybe there may not be too many players, or maybe too many players in the middle. But when you think about the immutable truth, right, the immutable truth has to be, well, the code's going to be there, and the fans are going to be there. So when you sort of look directly, as really sort of uniquely you can at fan engagement, what do you think? What are the things that go through your mind in terms of fan engagement, whether it's metrics or views? What's your perspective on what will make you successful and what defines success and engagement for you?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that I wasn't prepared for coming into this role is that I'm used to just going out to win the website battle. When I was at News Limited, it was just about, were we the #1 sports site in Australia? Whereas at Cricket Australia, sometimes I have to take a step back and sort of put on the Cricket Australia hat and sort of say, as long as cricket's being talked about more than other sports, in summer particularly, it's the area we really want to own, as long as cricket's being talked about more than soccer, then that's a really good thing for the organisation. But we've talked about this before, but I tend to believe in the digital world, there tends to be only 1 or 2 winners, and often only one. And if we're not trying to be in that conversation, then we're not going to last very long. And so what do we measure on? I'm actually not that interested in total audience, want to win that, but it's that engagement time. What the big sort of change for me is, one, I obviously want people to be engaged with our content when cricket is on, but I feel like I'm now in a battle in entertainment. So I want people to be choosing to watch cricket rather than watching 2.5 Men. So how do we start it's not just about soccer, but it's also competing with people on, choosing their on-demand content. How do we start getting into that space and expand people's consumption of cricket beyond just around live matches? Because I want to build a 12-month of the year digital product, and cricket's only played in Australia for 4 months of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that point you make about #1 or #2, right? And we have this sort of impression that the digital world is incredibly democratic, right? Because anybody can play there. But in fact, when you look at the winners and the losers, there's usually a king, maybe a queen, and a bunch of people that really don't matter. And just doing okay in that space doesn't seem to work very well. So I think you really do need to shoot for that. One of the other conversations sort of floating around today was sort of sponsorship and advertisers, and sort of traditionally there's a sort of pretty hard line drawn between what's a sponsor and what's an advertiser. Do you see that continuing, blurring, going away? Do you have a vision on that in terms of where you see that?
Yeah, it's blurring all the time. It started at news, and it's interesting. I started off as a print journalist, and then I went into digital, and it was funny just going from a really established business model to one that was evolving, how much closer you were to the advertisers. And it was just an assumption in digital that you would be, I think because you had to work harder to get the dollars, that you were much more open to branded content or crafting a content idea around something in a way that would support a sponsor's campaign themselves. Now, at Cricket Australia, we've got really established relationships with most of our sponsors. Guys, people like the Commonwealth Bank and KFC and CUB have been with us for a long time. So, for me, again, it's not just about how they interact on our platforms. We work really hard with them so that their campaigns are really reflective of Cricket Australia's values. You look at like Commonwealth Bank's campaign last year around their cricket club. Looks like something Cricket Australia would be proud. Would be something we'd be proud to produce. So it's easier when you've got content that a lot of people want to watch. So you don't have to work very hard with sponsors to convince them to be part of that. But you still go through the same battles when, I'm probably going to say something that's a bit blasphemous here, but when agencies throw up really dumb ideas and they want to put that on your platforms, and you've got to talk them around to a good idea, because what I do every day is know what people want to watch, and someone who doesn't do that every day probably doesn't know that as well as me.
So maybe I suppose at least the broad answer is kind of a continuum, right?
Yeah. It's not a very I'd love to be able to say that there's a definitive point then, but you look at the growth of digital revenue in Australia. If you take search out of it, even in 5 years' time, digital's still likely to be behind broadcast.
Yeah, true. Although, from some of my background in the music industry, right? I started licensing music in '96. Between '96 to 2001, 2002, it was less than 1% of the market. 2005, it was 2.5%. By the time 2010 came along, it was 55%.
Yeah, it can happen.
So the question is always, when's that inflection point? I think that's sort of the compelling leadership question, right? When and how do you engage? And the answer is you need to be engaged, because you never know when that point's going to happen in terms of where it goes forward. So on sort of the fan continuum landscape, where does stadium and venue fit in? We've heard some comments. In fact, the previous panel talked a little bit about it. How do you view the in-stadium engagement? Where does that fit in digital? How does that fit in the context and continuum of fan experience?
Yeah, I'm really jealous whenever, I think we all would have seen at least probably 6 different case studies on the Barclays Center from the US. But, I'm really jealous when they see those US examples where a sporting team owns the stadium, and maybe even owns the broadcast and everything.
The 49ers are the darling story.
Sorry, it's now Levi Stadium that everyone talks about. Yeah. We don't own any of our stadiums. We work really hard with them, and we've just got a basic challenge that it's hard to send a text message from the MCG when there's 60,000 people there, let alone really start engaging people on a digital platform. But, fan engagement's really important because we want people to choose to go to the cricket over doing other activities. But I think someone called out this earlier. People often confuse, that fan engagement with ensuring that fans consume your content when they're at the stadium. And I don't think that's the case. I've never seen a study that says that people won't buy a ticket because they can't watch a live stream on their phone at the ground. What annoys them is that they can't get onto Facebook at the ground.
Right.
And holistically, people taking photos themselves of the cricket, putting it on Facebook, that's the greatest marketing we can have. So we should be encouraging that, and also we should be encouraging it because that's just how people enjoy spending their time now. But I don't see that being a huge uplift for my products. I don't see that as sort of really, really influencing sort of the uptake of the products. And then, all that stuff around ordering to your seat and stuff sounds really nice, but again, I haven't seen really hard metrics that prove that's really determining that people will spend their money and time going to your event over doing something else. It's such a complex set of things that determine how people spend their time that the digital's a part of it, but there's a lot of other factors. Like, if you want to increase fan enjoyment, in Australia, give them better variety of food and drink and charge them less for it. That'll send your metrics to the roof more than being able to watch a video at the game.
When, just on that subject of sort of your competitive view, it was pretty clear from one of the graphs you showed in the video who you think at least some of your competition is. How broadly do you think about that sort of competitive landscape? You talked about a 12-month clock. You've got, clearly you've got competition for everything from specific, butts and seats all the way through to people's time. Just when you sort of step back a little bit and say, all right, here are the 3 or 4 things that keep me up at night in terms of competition, what comes to mind?
The big one is like to win in digital. I really believe you win it hour or minute by minute, really. And you never get time to sort of sit back and breathe, if you're in the heart of it. So trying to find that balance to making sure that we have a newsroom of 11 journalists and editors, and we're up against News Corp and Cricinfo that are much, much bigger. So how do we efficiently assure that we cover news quicker, better? All those things that I think really determine the success of a news site, which is what we're trying to get into that space. But for me, sort of the nut that everyone's trying to crack is sort of how do you what's the future business model for the digital and business for us, as Cricket Australia, and you can see ways it's being done in the States, and you can see the way that other cricket boards choose to do it. It tends to be a lot of outsourcing of that there, and ensuring that while I'm looking after the holistic growth of cricket, that I'm also ensuring that my division is making substantial money. And so, I've got a 4-year rights deal, and that doesn't feel like very long to get it right when it's so much. It's a cliche, but it's true. But when it's evolving so quickly,
and I guess that circles back around to the core notion that you do have unique access, but you got to be careful to maintain your credibility so you don't screw that up. Because at the end of the day, if there's one advantage you have, I guess that's the advantage that you have.
Yeah, and it's treading that fine line, and it's all journalists go through a issue of you've got to maintain trust with the players you want to interview. At news, you wouldn't want to get players off site because they never talk to you. So my guys are really close to them. They've got to report stuff that gets the fans really close, but we've also got to respect our relationship with the players because at the end of the day, the players are what bring people to the product. It's not the game of cricket itself. Last summer, winning helped. Mitchell Johnson helped even more. Absolutely. He was a redemption story. He was the most exciting thing that's happened in cricket in the last 12 months is every time Mitchell Johnson comes on to bowl. And so if we're not able to get fans close to that, then we're not going to win in that space. So, that's a really interesting line for my guys to walk every day when they're on the road with the team. But, if you're sort of something that keeps me awake at night, I hope we keep creating Mitchell Johnsons, or even better, can we put Mitchell Johnson in some kind of, program to ensure that he doesn't get old and he keeps playing exactly the way he is?
Yeah, people get so fixated on the idea of storyline. I teach at the Sydney Film School, and there's 7 storylines that define any movie. And so it's really not, yes, you need a good story, but it's really not the storyline. At the end of the day, it's the characters, right? That's what Disney does well. That's what Pixar does well. So speaking of relationships, while Australia may be an island, right, you don't certainly float on your own as an association. So you've got the ICC, you've got other codes. Do you think about them? How does that fit into your vision of what you're trying to achieve? Is that relevant? Is it not relevant? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the challenge I probably wasn't sort of completely appreciative of before I joined Cricket Australia was around the rights. It's so fragmented, and I think it'd be really nice going forward if the cricket boards all got together and could come to some kind of joint view on what we're going to do.
Yeah, that'll happen tomorrow.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's easy. I don't know why anyone does it. And it's interesting where most other sports, the governing body owns that digital. NBA owns the digital experience. If you want to read about baseball, you go to MLB.com. That's not the case in cricket. Cricinfo is the sort of default global leader without any rights. And our relationship is interesting in terms of the content we create. There's no doubt other cricket boards don't appreciate what we put on content up there. It was reported that the ECB complained about one of the videos we did, which just happened to highlight their wicket-keeper going through a horrible trot of form, and they thought that we were mocking him. We're like, no, it's just a story. This guy should be dropped. That's what we're reporting on. We're not pointing and laughing. It's just a news story. And the other cricket boards in the ICC, I think, are maybe coming around to it, but it's been a rude shock for them.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the overall journey that a lot of people are on in this, in this space, and you sort of think back on really, I guess, the year and a half, 2 years so far or 2 years so far in the journey for you, what are some of the core underpinnings you think about as whether we're talking to broadcasters, sports codes, sponsors, and you think about the digital space, what are some of the core principles they should be thinking about as they drive forward?
Own the moment, and that, because if you've got the video rights, you should own that moment. The whole thing about social, not everyone's watching, certainly not cricket, goes 7 hours a day, right? No one's watching all 7 hours of 5 days of a test. So when something happens, how do you seize that moment and how do you make that work for you? When I was recruiting journalists to work for me, the first thing I wanted to do was get credibility. So I went and got the best cricket writer that I could find, and a guy called Andrew Ramsey, who'd covered the team for a long time. Beautiful writer, but brings instant credibility. The next thing I hired was the best social media guy that I knew, a guy called Ben Wise, who was working for Southern Cross Stereo in Australia, because I knew, one, we weren't seen as a destination for great content, so we needed to go out and draw people in, but I just know all those metrics about where people are spending their time. In Australia, what Facebook says, there's 9 million Australians who access Facebook each day. Well, I would love to have that audience, so I'm going to make sure that I'm there for them. And hopefully I turn it into a habit, they come to us. But when something big happens in world cricket, whether it involves Australia or not, we're trying to own that moment. And I think we're working really hard at it. And I'm so proud of the team, the way they think social first. But that's where I'd put all the effort. That and the build characters, help flesh out the backstory of your characters. And we know the players are not necessarily what the public impression is. We want people to really love and care for the players, because again, that'll keep them in the game for so much longer. Keep them engaged with our content so much longer if they see those people as Shakespearean characters rather than a guy who's just bowling a ball.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'll do my bit to get us out of here on time for lunch with just sort of one last question. So if in particular, if you sort of walked off the street and were listening to this conference, the sports ecosystem is not simple. All right, it's a complicated place. One of my favorite end interview questions is the magic wand question, right? So you got a magic wand, all right? You can change something today in the sports ecosystem as you see it, or two things if you want. What comes to your mind in terms of things that you think really need to or should change to give the kind of momentum, give the kind of drive that sport needs clearly around APAC, but then secondarily, obviously, to the world you look at?
Yeah. So really glib answer in Australia is the infrastructure, like that broadband speed, aren't good enough, connection,
that NBN
expensive,
thing.
blah, 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 blah. From a cricket perspective, kind of called it out earlier, it's around the rights issues. I think as a sport for cricket, I don't know that we're serving the fans as well as we should be. And I think the rights deals make that hard. Like as a consumer, I'm a cricket fan, an Australian cricket fan, and I've got to know who has the rights deal to know where to go and find that video content of when the Australian cricket team's playing. Now, obviously, selfishly, I'd rather that cricket.com.au has all those rights. But I just think it's a confusing experience for the fan. You've got to go, they're playing away. Oh, that's right, I read that Fox Sports has got the deal, so I should go on. That's crazy. And, if all the lessons that we're learning around consumer behaviour, what I watch, when I want, where I want, blah, 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 we're making that difficult for them. And we'll continue to, because the money is high, but I think it would be nice that there's some momentum towards having a unified approach to what are the rules of engagement between rights holders and broadcasters so that everyone wins. We want people watching on TV as much, I think, as you said to me, it's broadcast rights deals have only got, that notion, have only got a few years to run. It's rights deals on whatever platform. And so, I think we need to have a better job at a holistic approach across all of the major cricket boards and now broadcasters, but that would take a really big wand.
Yeah, no, I agree. And look, when the Aussie team's touring, it's a pain in the ass because I got to look all over the place to see if I can find them. But at least you're doing you bit. When the Australian team is in Australia and playing, I know the place to go. It's all there, and you guys are doing just a terrific job. For those of you who live in Australia, visit Australia, download the app and go experience it because it really is one of these unique. And I think the NFL is the only other one I really would point that strongly to that's really been able to capture the full experience in one place for a fan. You've done a terrific job so far. Looking forward to the next few years as we.
We've got an exciting new website as rolled out by Accenture coming this summer.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Finn. Please thank Finn for the time he spent with us today.
Thanks, guys.